church parking lot, a woman is found murdered. The killer leaves few clues and no weapon. A routine suicide investigation takes a macabre twist. Can a camera prove this was murder? And a fire rages in a nursing home, killing 15 residents. Armed only with his photographs, it will take the coroner 6 years to prove this tragedy was no accident. Forensic photographers solved these crimes by preserving crucial details missed by the naked eye. After the evidence is erased, the new detectives must rely on camera clues. In Fairfax County, Virginia, in March 1989, a man called police to report a woman had fallen in an icy church parking lot. An officer reported back from the scene. The woman didn't slip and fall. She was murdered. At police headquarters, forensic photographer Jeff Miller knew he had a long night ahead of him. He packed his equipment and got ready to meet investigators gathering at the scene. Where some officers shoot criminals, Miller shoots film. In his 18 years with the Fairfax Police, he has witnessed countless crime scenes through his lens. If he is the eyes of law enforcement, then his photos are its long-term memory.
Hey, this is the ID we got off of the victim.
Investigators arrived at the parking lot and planned their strategy. Detective Ed Guckenberger headed the investigation. As his team uncovered clues, they depended on Miller. It's in Miller's camera that all the clues come together to solve a case and hopefully to catch a killer.
We want to be able to document the scene, in essence, take the scene from here to the courthouse just exactly the same way that we find it.
Miller began by mapping the crime scene. The initial clues were both simple and brutal. The victim was lying face up in a pool of her own blood. She had been shot several times, with the fatal bullet to her head. Nearby, her purse was found untouched. Robbery was not the motive. Miller first documented the wide view of the crime scene, which was blanketed in darkness. To bring it into focus, Miller used a technique called painting with light. The camera was mounted on a tripod. Its shutter kept open as an assistant covered the lens. The same frame of film was exposed repeatedly as Miller passed along the edges of the scene, firing his flash as many as 24 times for a single picture. Each flash illuminates a slightly different area. This photograph is the result of Miller's work. The bright lights look like street lamps, but they were made by Miller's flash. Though he was holding the flash as it fired, Miller doesn't appear because he was behind the light. He remained invisible as he exposed the evidence. After Miller took his wide shot by painting with light, he moved in to photograph every detail of the scene. He worked his way closer and closer to the victim, documenting her wounds and the position of her body.
You guys see these bloody tire tracks?
Miller discovered some bloody tire tracks near the victim.
It looks like when the vehicle left here, it ran through the pool of blood.
Officers were sent to follow the trail, while others stayed behind to comb for additional clues. Miller found 2 bullet casings. the man who called the police parked his van over them. Miller photographed the evidence where it lay. Moving the van again would only have disturbed more of the crime scene.
Hey guys.
As Miller hunted for additional evidence, officers returned from their search of the neighborhood. They found an abandoned car a block away. They ran the tags. It was registered to the victim's address. The site of the car became a second crime scene. Again, Miller photographed the scene from every angle, hoping to uncover any clues that might explain how the woman ended up so far from her vehicle. As he did at the church parking lot, Miller first photographed the site at a distance, then moved in for close-ups. The driver's side window was shattered. Pellets of glass were strewn about the car's interior. A spent cartridge lay in the snow outside the driver's side door, and a bullet was lodged in the plastic molding. On the passenger's side, Miller found even more. Pressed into the thin snow were footprints, too big to be the victim's. Forensic technicians have a tough time making casts of snowy tracks, and Miller knew the prints would melt with the rising sun. So it was up to him and his camera to preserve the evidence before it faded away.
You can cut it out if it's in ice and try to keep it at a certain temperature and everything else. Well, I guess sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. There are different chemicals that you could possibly spray on it to try and keep it. When all in all is said and done, the photograph is the only evidence that was able to totally keep that impression intact.
The search of the neighborhood uncovered more potential evidence. A patrolman found a second car abandoned a half-mile from the church parking lot after apparently skidding off the road. The second car became the third crime scene during this night of sporadic clues. Police began to search for a connection. On the seat, an officer found a leather gun holster. He ran the tags on the vehicle. The owner lived just 2 doors from the victim.
Process this scene.
At dawn, Jeff Miller inspected the church parking lot again. He hoped the sun would shed new light on the case. By now, the snow had melted.
We wanted to come back and check the asphalt parking lot and make sure that we collected all the evidence. We don't want to leave anything behind. Once we leave here, you can't come back.
His effort paid off. Daylight revealed fragments of glass buried in the snow the night before. If the glass matched the broken window in the victim's car, police could say the car was in the parking lot when she was killed.
Okay, there's something over here.
The melting snow also revealed a bullet at the edge of the lot.
So tell you what, let me get a couple pictures of it first.
Tests would determine if it matched the bullet found in the victim's car. While Miller checked the parking lot, Ed Guckenberger hit the road. His first stop, the victim's house. In homicide cases, family members are usually the first suspects.
I have to read very quickly once I knock on that door the type of response that I get from that person who opens it. And in this case, I had a husband that was dressed in a bathroom that I had woken up out of his sleep. We stated that His wife should have been home, and she was at a church meeting. As a homicide investigator, what you then have to do is you have to read that person. Does he seem sincere? Is this some ploy or something else? Well, there was nothing from what he was telling me to show that he was in any way involved in this.
Confident the husband wasn't involved with the woman's murder, officers followed their next lead. They didn't have far to go. The owner of the second car was the victim's neighbor. He was also no stranger to police. The churchyard murder investigation was less than 10 hours old. So far, Detective Guckenberger had no suspects. His only lead was the owner of the second car. The man police wanted to talk with was Gary Asa Donahue. Ed Guckenberger asked him to come to the station for questioning. To his buddies in his motorcycle gang, Donahue was known as Redneck. Police knew him by his criminal record. Donahue told police he'd been out drinking the night before. When he got home, he realized his dog was loose, so he drove around to look for it. He lost control of his car on the icy road and skidded into a ditch. Unable to get free, Donahue said he walked home. Although his route would have taken him past the victim's car, Donahue told police he didn't see it. He said the holster in his own car belonged to a friend, but he didn't have the gun. Police were suspicious. They asked Donahue for his jacket and boots, which might hold clues that told a different story. Donahue willingly surrendered them. In the darkroom, Miller developed one of his most hopeful leads. Up until now, he'd been merely documenting the various crime scenes. Now, he put his darkroom skills to the test to flush out latent clues. Using the ruler he placed by the icy footprints when he snapped the photo, Miller created a life-size portrait of the prints. A boot print can be almost as telling as a fingerprint, if it's clear enough. Miller was happy with the photo. Armed with this image, it became just a matter of matching the prints to the boots that made them. Miller sent his photographs to a forensic lab for a detailed comparison with Donahue's boots. Lab technicians first examined the size of the boots. If the prints are off, even by a few millimeters, there is no match. The tread pattern was examined next. Technicians pored over the sole of the boot, making sure that every detail matched Miller's photograph. So far, so good. But next came the litmus test, matching the boot to the foot that wore it. It required a close look at the boot's anatomical wear.
Anatomical wear is the wear that each of us impart into the bottom of the shoe based on how tall we are, how much we weigh, our bone makeup, how we walk, whether we walk on the inside of our feet, the outside of our feet, more so on the heel, more so on the toe.
Donahue wore a lift in one of his boots. It added to the unique anatomical wear and left its signature in the boot prints. Last, technicians examined the boots and the photographs for accidental wear and tear, nicks and cuts from daily use.
In this particular case, there are certain marks, certain cuts, certain indentations in the tread pattern that the examiner was able to see in the photograph and was able to find also in the shoe, that he's able to say that this shoe made this impression to the exclusion of all the other shoes in the whole wide world.
The footprint evidence placed Donahue at the victim's car. Guckenberger credits the photographs with keeping the investigation on track.
If We didn't have the photographs of that shoe impression. Then we're mainly just stuck with firearms evidence. A person might have a gun, but who actually shoots that gun? But this person wears his own boots.
Investigators then examined Donahue's jacket, combing it meticulously for fibers, hair, cloth, anything that might link Donahue to the victim. They found glass particles. What new information could they provide? Forensic tests determined the glass from the victim's car matched the glass in the parking lot. If the glass from Donahue's jacket matched these samples, it would place Donahue at the site where the car window was shattered and where the victim was killed. The glass matched. Police could now prove that Donahue was in the parking lot and maybe in the car at the time of the murder. The bloody tire tracks were the next link. Because the victim couldn't have driven through her own blood, investigators were able to show she was killed in the parking lot and that somebody else moved her car.
As her car was leaving the scene, it drove through a pool of blood that was coming from her. The blood adhered to the tire, and the rotation of the tire through the parking lot kept leaving a blood transfer onto the ground. And so that's what that was from.
The scattered clues were coming together, thanks in large part to Miller's accurate documentation of the scene. The only thing missing was the murder weapon. To help pinpoint it, investigators tested the bullets and casings found near the victim and her car. Another casing was found in Donahue's car. Lab tests showed all the casings were fired from a rare Hungarian pistol, a 9mm auto-loading Fromer, a gun that peaked in popularity around World War II. Tests of the impression on the holster from Donahue's car matched the impression a Fromer would make. But the gun was nowhere to be found. Police scoured the area and came up empty. Donahue, for all his earlier cooperation, drew the line at providing the gun, swearing he never had it.
And he probably thought that whatever he did with this gun, and I don't know, we never did find that gun, probably thought that he was past all this. That if we didn't have a gun, we probably could not prove that he was the one that actually fired the shot or did anything else.
But if there ever was a smoking gun in this case, it was Miller's photographs of the boot prints, something Donahue didn't count on. Officer Miller and Detective Guckenberger began to build their case. With the glass fragments, the shell casings, the bullets, and the ever-important boot prints, they were confident they could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Gary Asa Donahue was a killer.
Okay, great.
Miller's photographs became primary evidence before a grand jury, which sent back Donahue's indictment. The photographic clues that Miller provided helped piece together the story of that ill-fated night.
Okay, what I believe happened is that Mr. Donahue's driving down the street. He turns down the wrong street to go to his house, probably because he's drunk.
Donahue lost control of his car and slid off the road. Angry, he got out of the car and began to walk home. As the victim came down the street, she recognized the car. She likely had seen it in her neighborhood for years. Donahue bought it from another neighbor.
Perhaps she's acting as a good Samaritan. She stops to offer him a ride, or perhaps he stepped out on the road and flagged her down. The other possibility is he stepped out on the road with a gun and made her stop for him. They go down the street to the church parking lot. Something occurs inside the car in the church. I don't know what that is. In homicide investigation, you're not always going to be able to answer every single question that you have. She falls down to the ground, lays down on her back, face up. Donahue then has a better target, a non-moving target. He then advances towards her, and as she's lying there on the ground, he puts the gun right up to her face almost and executes her. He then leaves the scene, drives down to the end of the street, where again, for whatever reason, he runs off the road, probably due to his intoxication, runs off the road, wrecks it into the trees. For whatever reason, he decides to clear his weapon. He works the action, the one cartridge casing that's still in the gun, ejects out the broken driver's window, and is found on the ground next to the vehicle.
For whatever reason, he slid across the seat and left by the passenger's side, leaving his boot prints in the snow.
This is your worst type of killer, because this is the person that kills out of meanness. There was no reason at all to kill this woman. She was not, your victim that puts herself in a situation because of a crime. She's not that type of person. She's the type of person that her innocence is what got her into trouble. That day, she ran across an animal.
Gary Asa Donahue was sentenced to life in prison. The senseless death of the woman in the church parking lot shocked the residents of her quiet community. Further south, in Miami, Florida, murder is more common, but no less shocking. Through these doors at the Metro-Dade County Morgue in Florida come every kind of death, both natural and unnatural. As bodies come into the morgue, it's the job of forensic photographers to document wounds and other identifying traits before the corpses are stored. The work is never routine and often tragic. On this day, a 5-year-old girl is the victim of a random shooting. She was caught in crossfire during a parade. Forensic technicians examine her wounds. Perhaps they hold the key to the killer. Dade County detectives rely on the information to start their investigation.
We are trying to determine, number one, what caliber of round it was that did strike the victim. And number two, the path of the bullet as it entered the body and then exited. That will help us in trying to determine possibly who our shooter is.
In the medical examiner's office, high-tech photography is as much a tool of the trade as a scalpel. If a death looks suspicious, it's up to forensic photographers to document the details. They start with the wound and then photograph individual organs as the autopsy proceeds. These gruesome photographs survive long after a case is closed. They provide a visual database authorities can refer to if a similar case comes up. Knowing what to look for streamlines any investigation. In 1986, Dade County Police responded to a suicide. Jack Sebastian lay dead, a 12-gauge shotgun by his side. When death is involved, it's standard procedure to capture everything on film.
Did you see anyone enter or leave the house?
The victim's girlfriend told police she was outside when she heard the blast.
I wanted to get everything.
Sebastian left no note. At the morgue, a staff member felt suspicious about Sebastian's wound and called medical examiner Jay Barnhart.
Good morning, Dr. Alvarez. What do you have?
This case came in as a
Barnhart mapped and measured the wound.
Which appears
In his initial opinion, this was no suicide. Sebastian was shot almost directly between the eyes. His wound was surrounded by stippling, small speckled burns made by the gunpowder exploding from the shotgun's muzzle. If Sebastian held the gun directly to his head, the gunpowder wouldn't have marked his face. From the stippling, Barnhart knew the gun must have been held some distance from Sebastian's forehead when he pulled the trigger. Something wasn't right, and Barnhart was determined to get to the bottom of it. First, Barnhart ordered photographs of Sebastian's wounds. Then he took X-rays of Sebastian's head to reveal the internal damage he couldn't see. The X-ray showed the path of the pellets.
This is an X-ray showing the dispersion of the birdshot through the skull. And if we take the point of entrance, which is just above the bridge of the nose, and connect that by an imaginary line or series of lines to the location of the pellets, we see that the pellets are to the left and below the point of entrance, meaning that the shot then was coming from above and to the right of the entrance.
Barnhart had to find out if Sebastian could hold the gun at the angle indicated by the X-ray. It wouldn't have been easy. Investigators even placed the shotgun in the extended arms of Sebastian's corpse to see if he could fire the gun. His fingers could barely reach the trigger. Considering all possibilities, investigators tried to fire the gun with their feet. They found they could do it with bare toes. But Sebastian wore round-toed boots, making it impossible for him to fire the gun. These extreme tests were necessary. Barnhart knew that in court, he must be prepared to answer even the strangest questions.
They'll ask you things like, well, couldn't he have been laying in bed and have his foot up over his head and pulled it with his... and if he had not been wearing shoes, you'd probably have to say, yes, he could.
Barnhart wasn't satisfied with his findings. He needed to determine the distance between Sebastian and the gun when it fired. Barnhart and his staff shot a piece of poster board from distances of 1 to 7 feet and examined the damage. From 1 foot away, the force of the shot cracked the board. The impact was enormous. At 2 feet, the impact was less severe as the buckshot began to spread. At 4 feet, the hole roughly doubled in size as the pellets fanned out. At 6 feet from the board, the buckshot dispersed further, leaving clear pellet marks. Barnhart concluded the muzzle of the gun had to be at least 1.5 feet away from Sebastian's head. He was convinced someone else must have pulled the trigger. But Barnhart feared his simple test wasn't enough to sway a jury. He turned to the Forensic Imaging Bureau for help. Todd Reeves runs Dade County's Forensic Imaging Bureau, one of the best in the United States. The Bureau has more than 3,000 square feet of advanced photographic equipment. The well-equipped studios can document huge pieces of evidence while capturing clues invisible to the naked eye. Here, a technician uses a microscope-equipped camera to examine a cast of a jawbone. Her findings will help match a suspect to a bite mark. A potentially useful image may come from a less than perfect source, like a security camera or shot from a moving vehicle. The lab can clean up, enlarge, and enhance photographs. Computers reveal unseen details in evidence photos, bringing clues into focus. A huge computer database of fingerprints can match even the vaguest finger smudge. An editing suite helps investigators assemble persuasive courtroom presentations.
The higher the quality, the better delineation you're giving the jury, the more factual information. And that's what we're providing is fact, not fiction. And that's the true message behind professional forensic photography.
Jay Barnhart knew he had a case for the murder of Jack Sebastian. But he'd rely on Reeves and his high-tech tools to make it bulletproof.
We've got a case of this biker.
Every fatal wound tells a tale. In the case of Jack Sebastian, the injuries around the wound completed the story. When a gun fires, it shoots more than projectiles. From the muzzle comes a flash of fire, a blast of gas, a puff of smoke, and a shower of sparks. Each can leave its mark. Place the muzzle of a gun directly against the target, and all this debris goes into the wound. Pull the muzzle further away, and the debris becomes more and more dispersed. The forensic photographs of Sebastian's injuries showed the stippling wounds. They also revealed bruising under the eyes, on the nose, and on the cheek. Barnhart believed the damage was caused by the open petals of the shot cup, a plastic sleeve that holds the buckshot. But how far away would the shotgun have to be to allow the shot cup petals to open? Barnhart and Reeves believed high-speed photography could provide the definitive answer.
And it allows the doctors and the police that are investigating the case to be able to see things we can't see with the human eye, things that are moving as fast as Mach 15.
High-speed photography can stop a bullet in midair. More than that, it allows investigators to examine, frame by frame, the impact and damage that bullet produces as it connects with its target. Wounds can then be matched with bullets. In cases where no weapon is found or a bullet isn't recovered, a series of high-speed photos may help investigators make the identification. Reeves and Barnhart designed an experiment to determine the distance between Sebastian's head and the muzzle of the gun that killed him.
I don't know if there's any, I think we have film in the 35.
Crank it in there after it's in the vise.
They mounted a shotgun on a rack, held perfectly level. Next, they positioned two cameras along the line of fire. As the shell and debris left the muzzle, they would fly past the cameras, which would snap their picture. It was crucial that the gun not move when fired. They loaded the gun with the same type of ammunition that killed Sebastian.
Let it go.
Fire in the hole. Okay.
Reeves then placed a sensitive microphone near the muzzle of the gun. When the microphone picks up the sound of the shotgun blast, it trips a flash unit. A ruler placed behind the microphone measures how far the shell travels as the shot cup petals begin to open. The high-speed flash fires for 1/2 millionth of a second, necessary when photographing at blazing speeds. For the clearest image, Reeves and Barnhart need the camera to be as close to the flying shell as possible, but must determine the best place to put it. They first try the test with a large format Polaroid camera. The fast-developing film allows them to take test photos of the experiment so they can position the second camera correctly. For the actual test, they use a standard 35mm camera with highly sensitive film to freeze the shell in its path. The investigators are now ready to try their experiment and catch a shell with a flash of light. If all goes well, they'll produce an irrefutable record of the shell and its components in flight. Barnhart can then use the information to verify where the plastic petals on the shot cup began to open into the pattern that damaged Sebastian's face. Each time the gun is fired, Reeves inches the microphone away from the muzzle. As a result, the flash will go off a little later. The projectile will travel a little farther. The camera will catch it as it opens in flight. Initially, the white-hot plastic shot cup hasn't expanded. After 18 inches, the petals begin to spread, discharging the pellets and falling away. At about 30 inches, the petals have fully opened. Barnhart and Reeves succeed in making a photographic point-by-point map of a shotgun shell's trajectory. By comparing the wound with the pictures, investigators determined the gun was fired from a distance of 18 to 24 inches from Sebastian's face.
Expand our database here.
The results corroborated Barnhart's own experiments and gave him the evidence he needed to prove Sebastian couldn't have possibly shot himself. Police then confronted Sebastian's girlfriend, Diane Shelton, with the evidence. She confessed to pulling the trigger and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Unlike any other tool, forensic photography can expose evidence that would otherwise have been missed. And sometimes, photographs are the only way to prove a crime was committed at all. When a Pennsylvania coroner was certain a tragic accident camouflaged a mass murder, his photographs became his only allies. Forensic photography played a crucial role in the investigation of a devastating fire in a nursing home. Retired Wayne County, Pennsylvania coroner Robert Jennings spent 6 years trying to prove the fiery deaths were no accident. Jennings has spent much of his life combining his role as coroner and his love of photography. He has been snapping shots for more than 45 years.
We got some fire to the left here. Let's go knock that down before we go in.
His story begins on the grim night of October 19, 1971. A fire killed all 15 residents of the Geiger nursing home, a private home attached to a farmhouse near Honesdale, Pennsylvania. Most of the victims were found in their beds, dead from smoke inhalation. A few were overcome as they crawled on the floor. As coroner, Jennings rushed to the scene. State police and firefighters had begun removing bodies before Jennings had a chance to document the area. After asking the firemen to stop, Jennings began photographing all he could. The location of the victims could prove important. Jennings tried to track the blaze with his camera lens inside the pitch-dark building. Time was of the essence. He went right to work, hoping his pictures could help determine what caused the blaze. But the darkness and smoke foiled his efforts. Reluctantly, he went home to await the sunrise. By the time he returned the next morning, the smoke had cleared and the gloom had lifted enough for him to get his shots of the ruins.
If your normal f-stop would be f11, then you would have to open up at least 2 more stops and give it more light to get the detail and so forth that's needed in this type of evidence photography, that at least arson experts have an opportunity to examine the charring and so forth.
Working in the crumbling shell of the building was time-consuming and treacherous. But Jennings was determined to commit every inch of the wreckage to film. He succeeded. Painting with light revealed details of an alligator burn, a charring pattern similar to the rough scales of the reptile. The pattern is created at very high temperatures. By illuminating the area from several angles, Jennings photographed the changes in the burn pattern. Later, he would refer to his photographs to trace the fire's path. Burn patterns on the walls suggested the blaze tore through the hallway. A section of the corridor was almost totally consumed. In one spot, the fire burned a hole in the floor. The destruction at this spot was unlike anywhere else in the building. Jennings focused his attention and his camera on the hole. He crawled under it, photographing its edges. Fires usually burn from the bottom up, igniting whatever's above them. But at this spot, the fire looked to have burned from the top down. To Jennings, that suggested an accelerant was used, some flammable liquid that seeped through the floor, carrying flames with it. Before Jennings completed his investigation, state police announced their findings. They concluded the fire began in the laundry room, caused by a bad thermocoupling in a clothes dryer. Jennings wasn't buying it. He'd spend the next 6 years trying to prove them wrong. Photographs were Jennings' only clues. The ceiling above the dryer where the state police said the fire started showed minimal damage compared to the highly charred hallway. The wires in the laundry room were still intact. Jennings even found unburned clothing inside the dryer. Picture by picture, he continued building his case. Today, a quarter century later, Jennings' evidence remains, though the building is long gone.
Within a few weeks after the fire, the building is totally destroyed and demolished, razed. So therefore, the evidence that I photographed, that's gone. And if you don't have the photographs there to support, to look it over, it's pretty hard to solve a crime.
For Jennings, not much has changed in the art and science of photography since he snapped his first picture. Today, as he did 25 years ago in the Geiger nursing home case, he processes his own photographs by hand, carefully controlling every step of exposure, developing, and printing. He sharpened his skills, both as a photographer and an investigator. He's gained a better sense of what to look for and how to capture it on film. A charred piece of timber, a pile of debris. These seemingly trivial objects can be clues that make or break a case. Jennings has to be sure no detail is overlooked. An investigation is a lot like a roll of exposed film. All the information is there. You just have to know how to make it visible. In his darkroom, Jennings exposes many secrets. And in the process, he sometimes develops even more questions. State police were impressed by Jennings' photographs, but still wouldn't concede the fire was arson. They didn't waver for one simple reason: no suspect. If the fire had been deliberately set, who lit the match? In the end, Jennings' pictures exposed him. Hoping to prove the fire was deliberately set, Jennings turned to Nurse Vaudine Lyon, the sole survivor of the blaze. She told him about one of the home's gentlest patients, Mr. Maurice Flynn. Mr. Flynn, a deeply shy and private man, would end each day in his room, reading the Bible by candlelight. So it was odd that after the fire, Flynn's body was found seated in the room of a married couple. He was the only patient not in his own room when the fire occurred. He was also the only patient found completely naked. Scarcely burned, he died seated in a chair with his arms and legs extended, as though crucified.
He was known as the gentleman of the house. He was there to help people, but he was very private. He wouldn't even leave a nurse or anyone with him when he's taking a shower. He just didn't want any help. And this was always a puzzling part as to why this particular person was found this distance away.
Flynn's own room was some 60 feet from where his body was found. The smoke and flame would have made that simple walk impossible. Jennings determined the blaze started at the intersection of the hallways. In order for Flynn to get to the couple's room during the fire, he would have had to pass right through it. On the other hand, if he wanted to escape the blaze, the exit was near his room, easily within his reach.
And it's impossible that he could have come down that distance and through that T intersection with the type of physical evidence that we found on his body, because he would have never made it, and he would have been completely charred.
Jennings wondered why Flynn was so far from his room while most everyone else died in bed from the fast-spreading blaze. On June 8, 1972, Robert Jennings exhumed the body of Maurice Flynn. Even before the autopsy, Jennings noticed something odd. Flynn's skin was almost cherry red, indicating carbon monoxide poisoning. The autopsy showed Flynn's lung tissue had absorbed gasoline vapors shortly before he died. More clues came out during Lyon's interview. Flynn was the only resident in the home allowed to have matches to light the candles by which he read his Bible. He also mowed the lawn around the nursing home, making him one of the only residents with access to gasoline. Flynn behaved strangely the day before the fire, ranting and citing biblical verse. The home's other residents also acted strangely. They paid off forgotten debts and talked of a journey to a better place.
Everything centered around the strange events of Mr. Flynn, why he was completely naked. One of his comments to one of the nurses on duty that day was that you come in this world naked and you leave it naked. And that stuck in our minds a lot with finding his completely nude body.
It looked like Jennings had his suspect. But state police wouldn't revise their conclusions. Jennings persisted. By early 1975, Jennings was confident that he had enough evidence to prove his case. He exercised his powers as coroner and swore in a jury of 6 men and women. He presented his findings while the state police defended their position during the 2-day legal battle. Afterward, the jury concluded the fire was caused by an illegal act by a person or persons unknown. They ruled that investigators should attempt to discover who caused the 15 deaths. Why Flynn set the fire will never be known. Some have speculated that his actions were the result of a deranged mind. Others have said Flynn and the other nursing home residents had all agreed to die, thinking it better to end their lives than live in the home. In the end, the closest we may ever come to finding out the cause of the fire lies in Jennings' photographs and his efforts at solving this crime. After the coroner jury's verdict, Jennings filled out the death certificates of the residents of the Geiger nursing home. 14 homicides and a suicide.
It was worth the effort. I felt that I had a duty to represent the other 14 people that paid a price their lives in this particular incident, and particularly for the families as well.
Forensic photography is the new detective's secret weapon. Often overlooked, it is crucial in a criminal investigation. Through sophisticated camera equipment, determination, and ingenuity, forensic photographers become the eyes and memories of investigators. They are also the advocates of the victims, helping bring criminals to justice. Investigators in Canada are on the trail of a killer. The key lies in the victim's cells. But has fire destroyed all the evidence? At a murder scene, a handful of cigarettes provides the only clue.
Under a blue or alternate light.
Will forensic detectives be able to unlock their secret? This young man was imprisoned for a rape he swears he didn't commit. Can science prove he's innocent? When police are stumped, they may turn to detectives in lab coats to uncover clues hidden inside the human cell. One strand of DNA can finger a killer or set the innocent free. The new shape of crime detection is a double helix. In July 1991, a janitor in Vancouver, British Columbia made a routine trip to the dumpster. But what he found was far from routine. Inside lay a body burned so completely he wasn't sure it was human. He ran to call police. Across town, detectives Al Catley and Rick Crook responded to the call. The homicide investigators had done this drill before. What may look like a human body sometimes turns out to be a practical joke, a discarded mannequin, or some other case of mistaken identity. They hoped that was all it was. Still, they had to check it out.
So when we walked over to take a look at inside the dumpster, there was just the outline of a human body. And in fact, it was so badly destroyed by the fire that it was questionable as to whether it was human, or we've had some instances of bear carcasses being destroyed after illegal hunting or something like that. And we didn't rule out that possibility.
You can't.
No.
The thing is, though,
The officers approached the dumpster carefully, making note of details that could become important later. The dumpster was cool to the touch when they arrived. The fire had been out for hours. A stain spread from the corner onto the pavement. Whoever set the blaze used more than enough flammable liquid to destroy the contents. A close inspection of the contents confirmed that this was no false alarm. There, amid the ashes of computer boxes, wooden flats, and scrap paper, lay a human body. After the detectives made their notes, the delicate removal of the fragile evidence began. It was gently placed in a body bag so as not to damage it any further. Then it went to the morgue, where a pathologist would examine the body for clues to its identity. Anything else that survived the blaze was also collected and sealed.
not surprising.
Surveying the scene, the detectives realized the murderer selected his site carefully. An industrial park closed for the weekend, surrounded by brush and trees.
In fact, we did establish that people were driving by roughly the time that we think that the homicide occurred, or the burning occurred, and there wasn't anything. You could have quite easily have driven up here and probably out without really seeing what you would have thought was a fire.
Homicides are often solved in the first 24 hours when investigators follow hot leads. But in this case, the fire had gone out. The trail had grown cold. If the murder happened just 5 years earlier, Crook and Catley would have relied solely on hunches and their talent for bulldogging a case until they had the answers. But by 1991, when this victim died, Crook and Catley knew they had an ally in the lab. A powerful new tool had been added to crime solving: DNA profiling. Investigators no longer needed a shred of evidence to solve a case. They only needed a single cell. As personal as the whorls and lines of a fingerprint, but far more difficult to hide, DNA is the next wave in scientific sleuthing. Today, scientists can extract DNA on a sweat-stained hat left by a nervous killer, from saliva on the stamp of an extortionist's letter, or from dried blood or skin scraped from underneath a victim's fingernails. Microscopic evidence has always been left behind by criminals. Only with the advent of DNA profiling has it become incriminating. DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, contains every detail that makes you human.
Back to where it was.
No two people, except identical twins, share the same patterns. DNA is small enough to fit inside the nucleus of every cell. Its shape is a double helix, like a spiral staircase wrapped around a column. Uncoiled, the double helix would stretch to 8 feet. About 99.5% of everyone's DNA is the same, but some sections vary greatly from person to person. By studying those sections, scientists can identify victims and unmask murderers. In the Virginia Division of Forensic Science in Richmond, Paul Ferrara runs one of the most progressive DNA testing labs in the country.
With the sensitivity of this technology, I don't know that I could go in and commit a violent crime and just not somehow leave something of me behind. And that's all it takes with this technology, just some little piece of me that's got a cell with a nucleus in it, and I'm in deep trouble.
Heat is the enemy of DNA, and fire is the bane of forensic investigators who try to recover DNA from torched crime scenes. A week after the victim was found, Crook and firefighters recreated the inferno to see if it could shed some light on the crime. Whether by design or accident, the killer left one lid open, creating a downdraft inside the dumpster. The rushing air whipped the flames into a frenzy. The surrounding trees hid what little smoke the fire produced. It burned at about 2,000 degrees for 30 to 40 minutes. By comparison, a crematorium burns between 1,000 to 1,400 degrees for about 3 hours. Police were lucky to have any remains at all. Now they had to figure out who was killed here. All the pathologist could tell them was that the victim was a white female. Traditional methods at a standstill. Detectives focused on X-rays. They showed the victim was shot in the head, but they also revealed a feature detectives hoped would identify her. David Sweet, a forensic odontologist or dental investigator, worked on the case. Teeth are the hardest substance in the human body, and the most difficult to destroy. When bodies can't be easily identified, odontologists look to the teeth to tell them about the victim. Their wear and condition can hold the story of a person's life, whether they were right or left-handed, drank water with fluoride as a child, or wore braces. By studying the victim's teeth, it was determined that she was in her early 20s. She had one extraordinary feature.
But the other thing that we realized when we examined the teeth was there was an extra tooth right in the center of the upper jaw between the upper central incisors. And those showed up very well in the x-rays that were taken after the victim died.
Crook ran a computer search that compared his findings with dental records of missing persons. None matched. Despite his best efforts, Crook was stymied. He still had a victim without a name and a murder without a suspect. Meanwhile, somewhere out there, a killer ran free, confident nothing could link him to his crime. What he didn't know was that a small piece of evidence could provide the missing link.
Looks great.
For 2 days, Detective Al Catley chased a ghost. Who was the woman in the dumpster? What awful chain of events led to her murder? Surely by now someone, a friend, a lover, a co-worker, was missing her. Catley asked his staff for missing persons reports. One stood out. Lynn Breeden, age 30. Her roommate filed the report. He had dropped her off at a friend's house. The friend saw her leaving a nightclub around 3 a.m. the night before the burned woman was found. She left with an unknown man. 3 days later, a woman posing as Lynn Breeden tried to empty her bank account. The woman presented a withdrawal slip with Breeden's account number.
Hi, I need to make a withdrawal.
Okay.
The teller knew she wasn't who she claimed to be. When she questioned the imposter, the woman became flustered. When the teller tried to detain the woman, she hurried out.
No, I need you to stay here.
Wait, I gotta go.
No, I need you to stay here.
A security camera captured the failed transaction. Analysis of the film revealed a man waiting for the woman in the parking lot. Police made a photo of the woman from the tape and ran it in the newspaper. She was identified and called in for questioning. She told police a friend had offered her $500 to scam the bank. She knew nothing of the murder. The friend was Chris Cruz, an exotic dancer who used the stage name Tony Devons. Detectives placed him under constant surveillance, then asked him to come in to speak with police. Not realizing police were watching him, Cruz parked his car 2 blocks from the station and walked the rest of the way. The surveillance officers called Sergeant Crook to tell him they thought Cruz must be hiding something in his car. When Cruz arrived at the station, police asked if they could search his car. He told them the car was at his parents' in another county. They knew he was lying. They told him they knew where he parked it, and they didn't need his permission to search it. Reluctantly, he handed over the keys. Forensic investigators took pictures of the car from every angle, carefully recording what they saw before touching it. They moved in closer to gather more evidence, collecting and photographing virtually everything. It was too soon to tell what might be important later. The men worked in teams. Some officers inspected the evidence, while others marked where it was found. Investigators found bloodstains on the sides and rear of the car. They marked the positions carefully. Later, the shape of the stains would be analyzed to calculate what direction the blood came from and its point of origin. These details are crucial for reconstructing a crime. Blood samples may also be collected for DNA analysis. Police searched the car inside and out. They looked through personal items in the back seat, hoping to find any piece of evidence to tie the victim to the car.
All right, it's 10:05. We're going into the trunk.
Next, they opened the trunk.
Oh, look at this right off the bat.
Inside, they found a gas can and other objects covered with blood.
Get a shot. 1 moment.
Beneath some clothing, they found several key pieces of evidence: a bloody tire iron and a .22 caliber rifle.
I'd say that's the deal.
Detectives now were almost certain Cruz killed Lynn Breeden, but they had no way of connecting the suspect to the victim. Cruz denied knowing her. He told friends he bought her identification on the black market, and police couldn't prove the blood on the car was hers. They needed to compare the DNA from the blood on the car to DNA from the victim. But where could they find the victim's DNA? They turned to David Sweet for help. He suggested looking for it in her impacted wisdom teeth. No one had ever tried it before, but it was their last hope.
We know theoretically that there are cells still embedded in the mineral tissues of the teeth, and we should be able to open the teeth, extract those cellular materials, and extract the DNA from the cells, and then process it in a forensic DNA analysis.
A tooth is an armor coating that surrounds a core of living tissue. Sweet hoped the tissue within the impacted wisdom teeth were protected from the fire by the thick jawbones surrounding them. He cut the first wisdom tooth from crown to root, but found no tissue inside. His second attempt was more successful. He found tissue, but he didn't know if its DNA was destroyed by the fire. He sent it to the lab to be tested. All he could do was wait. Did Chris Cruz kill Lynn Breeden? The answer was in a forensic lab in Vancouver, where the victim's tissue was sent for testing. Finally, Dr. Sweet received the results. The DNA survived the fire. What's more, further testing showed the DNA from the victim matched the DNA from the blood in Cruz's car. The lab calculated the odds that it wasn't the victim's blood were 1 in 540 million. Dr. Sweet proved that Lynn Breeden was in the car the night she died. Confronted with the overwhelming evidence, Chris Cruz confessed to murder. Based on interviews, detectives pieced together a likely scenario of that fatal night. Breeden once borrowed a great deal of money from Cruz. Now he wanted to collect. Breeden refused to pay him. Cruz lost his temper. Growing impatient, she got out of his car. Cruz beat her, shoved her body in the trunk, and drove to the dumpster. After he arrived at the secluded spot, the victim began to regain consciousness. Chris Cruz shot her. He thought the flames would erase all the evidence. How could he know the charge of murder would come from his victim's own mouth? Found guilty of second-degree murder, Chris Cruz received a life sentence. In rural Clay County, Alabama, a drive along Route 31 leads to a town caught between memories and progress, where turn-of-the-century storefronts share billing with a new city hall, where folks still get their news word of mouth, and where bad news and good news travel at about the same speed. Summertime slow. It's a safe place where parents don't think twice about giving their teenagers free rein to explore the land. A place where violence is an unwelcome stranger. On July 22, 1995, 3 riders on all-terrain vehicles discovered a burned mattress in the woods, and beneath it, what appeared to be blackened bones. They contacted Sheriff Ralph Toland, who responded to the call.
You think you've got a body? 3 miles. 3 miles east of 4977 intersection. Okay, we're on our way.
The men met the sheriff and led him to their grim discovery. It looked like murder. Toland began to secure the crime scene, but knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed to be sure no evidence was jeopardized.
I got down into the scene and I saw exactly what had happened. Saw the mattress charred and burned, nothing left but the springs over a skeleton. I just stopped everybody where they were at and told them to stop right there. Had them to go back out to the entrance from the road and ask them all just to secure it. I wanted forensic and the criminalist to come and help us collect all the evidence.
The man he wanted was Angelo Dellamana. A scientist with the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences, Dellamana never knows what he's going to find when he answers a call.
Whenever you get to a crime scene, you hope that it's been secure and cordoned off right after the discovery of the body. You don't want anybody into the crime scene that doesn't belong there. You don't want anybody messing up evidence. You want the evidence to be maintained in a secure fashion so that when you as a scientist get there to recover it, you can collect it without disturbing it, preserve it, bring it back to the laboratory, and do the tests that you need on it to find out who did the crime.
Dellamana marked the position of the body, the condition of the mattress and the surrounding area before he went to work collecting everything he could. Dellamana placed flags to mark the position of what little evidence he found. He marked 11 used cigarettes randomly scattered around the mattress. They hadn't been there long. That was a good sign. But who smoked them? The killer? The victim?
I felt it was going to be very hard not only to identify that person, but to generate some kind of evidence. I did feel at the crime scene that the cigarette butts present there were going to be very strong evidence because they did not look weathered. They were sitting up on top of the cushion of grass. I felt they had not been there very long.
As Dellamana assessed the situation, his technicians recorded the evidence. Since technicians don't want to leave part of themselves behind, they wear gloves. Delamana's people had been trained so they don't unwittingly destroy the very clues that they're trying to save. If forensic scientists are careless in how they collect, store, or process evidence, they'll leave themselves vulnerable to attacks in the courtroom. After the evidence was marked, photographed, and recorded, technicians carefully collected it. Bodies don't just turn up without someone missing them. Sheriff Toland already had a sinking suspicion about who the victim was. The week before, Jimmy Paris called him to report that his wife, Peggy Laughlin, was missing. Sheriff Toland decided it was time for his deputies to pay Paris a call.
You can't think of anywhere else she might have gone?
It was no secret around town that the couple had more than their share of knockdown, drag-out fights. No one would be surprised if Peggy just decided to up and leave. Meanwhile, the medical examiner compared the victim's backbone to spinal x-rays of Peggy Laughlin. They matched. Jimmy Paris became the prime suspect. But where was the evidence? Paris denied being anywhere near the woods that night. Delamana tried to put the pieces together, but he didn't have enough of them to complete the picture. The forensics team turned up nothing at the crime scene. The cigarettes were the only clue untouched by the fire. The answer must lie with them. Detectives told him both Peggy and Jimmy smoked.
You can be looking at a case and feel going in that there isn't very much evidence there. The investigators don't think there's very much there to work with. But when you, as a forensic scientist, find that small piece of evidence, that one link that can either nail the suspect or clear a falsely accused individual, the rush that comes from that makes all the long hours worthwhile.
If he could lift DNA from the cigarette filters, he could compare it to the DNA of Paris and Laughlin. If he could prove they were together in the woods, Toland could make a case against Paris. Delamana shined an ultraviolet light on the cigarettes. The light revealed the saliva-soaked areas. DNA can be obtained from saliva and lip cells. He marked the outline of the glowing portion he wanted to test. Then he carefully trimmed it away and sent it to the lab for DNA profiling.
To build a DNA profile, what we do first is we take our evidence sample, blood or saliva or whatever the DNA is in. Okay, what we do is we break open the cell and release the DNA. So we extract the DNA from whatever it's on. We clean it up and we look at specific areas or addresses on the DNA, and we make millions of copies of that area big enough so that we can see it. Once the DNA profile is done for each person in the case, we can then compare it to the evidence DNA profile and see if there's any matches there at all.
He was encouraged by the results. The lab identified DNA from 2 people, and 2 of the cigarettes held DNA from both people, meaning they shared their smokes. Could Delamana prove those 2 people were Jimmy Paris and Peggy Laughlin? Testing Paris's DNA was simple. Cooperating with police, he gave a blood sample, which provided ample DNA to analyze. But getting Laughlin's DNA proved much more difficult. Delamana had to try extracting it from her remains. He felt the best place to look for the DNA was in the marrow of the femur, or thigh bone. The largest bone in the body, it's the one most likely to have protected DNA from the fire. Bone marrow is rich in DNA. To expose as many cells as possible, Delamana ground it into a powder. He gave the powder to another scientist for DNA extraction. The scientist places the powder into a chemical bath that breaks open the cell's nuclei, releasing the DNA. Once the DNA is in the solution, bone fragments, chemicals, and impurities must be removed. The liquid goes through a series of microscopic filters. A centrifuge spins away the refuse. The filters trap the clean DNA. Theoretically, scientists can obtain DNA from just one cell. But to create a profile, they generally need thousands, though that number is decreasing. Not long ago, tests required a sample the size of a dime. Today, they can extract usable DNA from a drop of blood the size of a pinhead. The DNA is isolated. Now it's time to measure it. When the DNA is drawn through a membrane, it creates a band of color. By comparing the color, scientists can determine how much DNA they have. Delamana examines the results, which appear as small, dark bands on a piece of film. DNA is measured in minuscule quantities called nanograms, or billionths of a gram. The test results tell Delamana whether he has enough DNA to work with.
Unfortunately, there's only about 0.3 nanograms of DNA in that sample. That's point and then 9 zeros and a 3 grams of DNA in that sample.
Delamana didn't have enough usable DNA for testing. But he had an ace up his sleeve, a scientific process so revolutionary, its inventor, Carrie B. Mullis, won the Nobel Prize. Up until 1993, scientists could test DNA only if they had large quantities. But bacteria, heat, and time take their toll, degrading DNA and leaving it in fragments. A process called PCR, or polymerase chain reaction, enables scientists to make multiple copies of DNA. DNA is made up of 4 chemical units: adenine, A, thymine, T, guanine, G, and cytosine, C. These units are strung together like beads. A joins only with T, and G joins only with C. PCR works by splitting apart the double-stranded DNA like a zipper. The thermocycler heats the DNA, separating the A from the T and the G from the C, essentially unzipping the helix down the center. More of these chemicals are added to the solution, and the 2 halves of the helix use them to make themselves whole. Repeat the process, and the 2 become 4, and so on, until millions of copies are created and the sample can be measured. When making a DNA profile, scientists don't need to compare the entire DNA molecule. They only look at several sites along the helix. If these sites are the same on both samples, the DNA most likely came from the same person. It's considered a match. Scientists used PCR to create enough DNA from the bone to do a profile. But the quantity and quality of the DNA was poor, so they could measure only one site. But in order to make a match, they needed to identify at least 2 sites. How could they find that second site? Delamana knew that a child's DNA is a combination of both parents' DNA. To solve Peggy Laughlin's murder, Delamana needed help from her brothers and sisters. If he could do their profiles, then he could work backward and calculate Peggy's.
Once we knew we didn't have enough DNA to build Peggy's complete DNA profile, we had to go and get a blood sample from every one of her brothers and sisters that were in the United States. These samples came from all over the United States.
As Delamana's investigation continued, Sheriff Toland received a call about an abandoned van found in a neighboring town. A license check showed it belonged to Jimmy Paris. Inside, forensic scientists found blood on the ceiling and walls. Part of the carpeting had been torn out.
Over there. I tell you what, Dan, look above your head. Right above your head.
Whoa, yeah.
You got 3.
I see it.
Based on this evidence, they obtained a search warrant for Paris's home.
Hey, Jimmy. Hey. Sorry to borrow John. You let us in to help us just fine. Stand inside there, back off with John.
Deputies searched the house for any clues that could link Paris to his wife's death. But they found nothing. Then an officer checked the crawl space and found a section of blood-soaked carpet. It matched the missing piece from Paris's van like a jigsaw puzzle. The possession of the carpet linked Paris to the bloodied van. Police had the murder scene, they had the victim, and they had their suspect. The evidence was strong enough to arrest Jimmy Paris for the murder of his wife. But to strengthen their case for conviction, police needed to link Paris, the van, and the burned mattress together. To do that, Paris had to be placed with the victim just before her death. Angelo Dellamana was hard at work trying to accomplish just that. He was ready to make Peggy's DNA profile using the blood samples from her siblings.
We extracted them, put them through our full battery of DNA tests, and what we did was when we got the DNA profiles of the brothers and the sisters, we were able to work backwards and build the rest of Peggy's profile.
The genetic information Dellamana gathered from the siblings enabled him to complete the missing link on Peggy's DNA. Peggy's DNA matched the DNA on the cigarettes. Here was proof that Peggy was alive with Jimmy in the woods the night she died. For forensics expert Paul Ferrara, the DNA match was the kind of evidence that tipped the scales against Jimmy Paris.
When looking at DNA evidence and the weight that you put on that DNA evidence, take that and place it in perspective with other evidence of motive, means, and opportunity. And when you combine all of those together, then one can come to an informed opinion that a person is guilty beyond reasonable doubt.
Paris had the motive, means, and opportunity to kill Peggy Laughlin. He was a jealous man, and he'd begun to suspect Peggy of infidelity. On that night, he invited her into the woods. He brought along a mattress, placing it on the ground and covering it with a blanket. Peggy and Jimmy smoked and talked, casually tossing aside the spent cigarettes. There, in the saliva and lip cells, lay the code of the murderer's identity, waiting to reveal its secret. Then, something happened that triggered a rage that drove Jimmy Paris to homicide.
The baby is crying too.
You just leave the baby.
No, I'm gonna go get the baby. You hear me?
Paris knew he had to destroy the body if he wanted to escape detection. probably thought that if police couldn't find a body, they couldn't link him to the crime. He couldn't see that the evidence he had already left would be enough to convict him.
DNA analysis was crucial in the sense that it placed both the suspect and victim at the scene together. And in that case, having those small pieces of evidence allowed us to put a guilty man in prison and allow the family to put closure to a terrible incident.
In Alabama and Vancouver, scientists struggled to find DNA evidence to link a killer to his victim. But the power of DNA is not just its ability to put people behind bars. It also holds the key to setting them free. Attorney Barry Scheck, part of O.J. Simpson's criminal defense team, doesn't believe everyone behind bars is guilty. Using DNA, he's making a strong case. Scheck heads the Innocence Project, a program at the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law in New York. The program is dedicated to exonerating the innocent through DNA profiling.
Serological Institute.
And that they had actually responded, we have something but not enough to test.
Scheck provides the expertise. The students do the legwork, sifting through hundreds of cases, looking for those with the most promise. Once cases are identified, the students investigate whether the evidence still exists. If it does, they see if it can be used for DNA testing.
I don't know. There's nothing in the red well 2 yet.
It became clear to us that DNA had the power to go back into old cases, re-examine it, and exonerate people that had been convicted many years ago, that lots of people felt might be innocent.
The Innocence Project helped exonerate 30 of the 40 people released through DNA since the project began in 1992. Today, startling FBI statistics show that 1/4 to 1/3 of all DNA testing at its lab clears a suspect. No one knows how many innocent people remain in prison across the United States, but the Innocence Project is doing its best to find them.
Now we have all these cases of people who have been convicted who can credibly come forward and say, look, I didn't commit this crime. There was serological evidence that was introduced against me. There was hair evidence that was introduced against me, for example. Please test items in my case. It'll prove me innocent. And that's happening in case after case after case.
Louise Hochberg is the executive director of the Innocence Project. In 1993, a convict named Troy Webb appealed to her colleagues for help. He trusted DNA to prove he was innocent of rape.
Troy Webb first wrote to us in 1993, and I understand from Troy that the way he got to us was through his cellmate, who apparently was also a client of the Innocence Project.
Webb was arrested in 1988 after a rape victim picked him out of a photo lineup. Eyewitness identification has led to most convictions where defendants were later proved innocent through DNA profiling. Hochberg believed in Webb's innocence, but it would be 3 years before she and her students returned him to his family in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
The principal criteria for us is, number one, can this person make a credible claim of innocence? And number two, the most important, is there biological evidence in the case that we can test, which combined with other factors will be determinative, will prove that this person did not commit the crime for which he or she was convicted.
The Innocence Project had evidence in the case sent to Paul Ferrara's forensic lab in Richmond. There, scientists compared DNA from evidence left at the rape scene to DNA in a blood sample from Troy Webb.
The level of the technology, even 10 years ago, was such that we couldn't eliminate Troy Webb, for example, as the possible contributor of the genetic material. But by the same token, we wouldn't have been able to eliminate a large percent of the population.
Before they could start the testing process, the lab had to retrieve genetic material from evidence stored 7 years earlier. Once it was identified, they had to see if it contained viable DNA. They used an acid test to confirm the biological fluid was present. If the fluid is present, the indicator liquid turns purple. Another method is to use a light source, called an omnichrome, that makes fluids glow. If the scientist is looking for blood to test for DNA, she'll use a chemical called luminol to find it. Luminol can detect the faintest trace of blood, making it especially helpful in instances where blood may have been washed away by rain or where a killer has tried to remove it. In Troy Webb's case, investigators swabbed the evidence from the victim's clothing. The sample would contain the perpetrator's DNA. They'll compare it with Troy's DNA. Comparing DNA is a matter of comparing the lengths of strands of genetic code at specific points on the double helix. Scientists place the DNA sections they want to compare into a gel. The DNA has a negative charge, so scientists can use a positive charge to pull it through the gel. The longer pieces travel more slowly than the shorter pieces. So two pieces of the same length would move the same distance. If the DNA from the evidence and the suspect move the same distance across the gel, scientists know they're the same length and they have a match. If the segments don't move the same distance, they couldn't belong to the same person. The segment lengths can be seen and measured under lights that make the DNA fluoresce. These are the printouts of the actual DNA profiles in the Troy Webb case. They fade with time, so scientists take photographs for a permanent record. Scientists needed to compare only one site on Troy Webb's DNA strand to the DNA from the evidence. If it didn't match, he couldn't have committed the crime.
4.2, 4.3, and the corresponding pattern.
Besides comparing Webb's DNA to the evidence, it's also compared to the DNA of the victim and the rapist. The dot patterns make the differences between the DNA perfectly clear. None of the DNA matches the DNA from the evidence.
This DNA type did not come from Troy Webb, and the true rapist in this case is actually still at large right now.
On September 7th, 1996, the Innocence Project released the results. In Virginia, where new evidence may not be presented more than 21 days after sentencing, the only option was clemency. The governor reviewed the petition and granted the pardon.
There is no greater good that a lawyer can do, in my judgment, than to look back at old cases, and if it can be demonstrated that an injustice was done, to right it.
On October 16, 1996, Troy Webb emerged from prison a free man. The first thing he wanted to do was eat a 7-foot sub from Philadelphia Cold Cuts. He now works at the sub shop. He's made new friends and reestablished a bond with family. He lives with the same faith and hope that kept him going in prison, and he's grateful to the Innocence Project.
They're like family, really, you know, because wasn't for them, I'd probably still be locked up, you know. But they helped me, you know, for free at that, you know. So couldn't ask for too much more.
All hope is not lost of catching the real rapist. Virginia has amassed the largest database of DNA in the country by collecting blood samples from every convicted felon.
20,000 a year.
Tens of thousands of blood samples pour in every year, creating a backlog of more than 135,000 samples in cold storage. Still, of the nearly 10,000 DNA profiles in the databank, Virginia has already solved 18 crimes by matching DNA from the crime scene. If the DNA from the case can be matched with DNA in the databank, the rapist will be found.
Our DNA data bank here was one of the early ones created. I think we had one hit in 1993, none in 1994, and then 5 in 1995, then 12 in 1996 alone. And the database, even in 1996, only numbered less than 9,000 profiles out of those 130,000 samples we have. When we get to the point where we have the convicted felon profiles, all 130,000 of them, the number of these hits is going to skyrocket dramatically until the point at which they are commonplace. If you are innocent of a crime, DNA technology is your best friend, your best ally. But conversely, if you're guilty, it's your worst enemy.
DNA profiling holds tremendous power for a technology still in its infancy. In its first 10 years, the diminutive double helix has quickly become one of the new detectives' biggest allies, bringing criminals to justice and delivering justice to the innocent. A man retrieves the burned remains of someone who may be his brother. But how can he really be sure? Under the rubble of a burned-down house, investigators find the shattered remnants of a body. Can they piece together what happened? A scientist must identify a woman from scraps of burned bones weighing less than 3 paper clips. Will he be up to the challenge? The fate of a murder investigation hangs in the balance. For centuries, killers have relied on fire to conceal their crimes. But today, science is catching up with them. The consuming flames are powerless to destroy the burning evidence. Fire. Medieval alchemists saw it as a tool of transformation. Used correctly, it could turn dull lead into gleaming gold. Fire does transform, but not in the way the alchemists hoped. It is a process called oxidation, the speedy marriage of convenience between oxygen and another substance. The union creates new compounds, like carbon and water, while releasing enormous amounts of energy in the form of heat and light. All fires need an initiator, a spark to get them going. It's a little boost of energy that sets off the chain reaction. Then the fire burns until there's nothing left to burn. In Ohio, in 1994, Danny King started a fire, initiating a chain of events that transformed his entire world. King had a fiery relationship with his live-in girlfriend, Marilyn Garland. They had been together on and off for years and had a 3-year-old child. But one March night, things spun horribly out of control. Danny King shot and killed Marilyn Garland. Then he tried to hide every trace of his crime. He set the body afire and kept it burning in a metal drum for 2 days. Occasionally, he'd stir the brittle bones with a stick, burning them until they would burn no more. He took what was left and smashed it into little pieces with a hammer. He gathered the remains and dumped them in the river. He may have thought that without a body, there could be no proof of murder. Then he ditched the drum behind a warehouse in town, a place where similar drums stood. Certain he had gotten away with his crime, Danny King waited 6 days before he called the police to report Garland as a missing person. Lieutenant Ray Todd worked on the case.
Danny King reported Marilyn missing on the 26th, and said that she'd been gone for a week. Well, it wasn't unusual for Marilyn to just take off for a few days at a time and go party.
In his office, Lieutenant Todd reviewed King's missing persons report. Despite Garland's reputation, he had to take it seriously. He was joined on the case by Detective Gregory Macco. Macco found that Garland's family was taking the disappearance very seriously.
We talked to other family members, getting conflicting stories, some saying this is not her. This was her years ago when she was wild and free, but now she had a little boy. She wouldn't do this. She wouldn't leave the little boy behind. Something's wrong. They didn't believe that she just up and packed up and left. They actually believed that something had happened to her.
Detective Macco began investigating more thoroughly. It was standard procedure to interview the person who filed the report, so they called in Danny King for questioning.
He's a boyfriend, he's going to be a suspect, and our thinking was, let's eliminate him immediately.
That wasn't how it worked out. The interview took an unexpected turn.
After that interview process, we asked him if he would be willing to take a polygraph, a lie detector test. And he kind of hedged on it at first. So it just threw red flags.
They arranged the test for the next day and dismissed King. King should have gone home, but he didn't. He went to a bar, concerned about the polygraph, and began drinking. He met a drinking buddy there and confided that he was worried about the test. The more he drank, the more he talked. Soon he confessed to killing Garland. His friend could tell King was serious. He felt he had no choice but to go to the police.
He proceeded to tell me that he just left the bar where him and Danny King were drinking for a couple of hours, and that Danny King had confessed to him.
Now the police had 3 facts to go on: a missing woman, a second-hand barroom confession, and a suspect who was nervous about a polygraph test. In terms of evidence, it was shaky at best. But Detective Macco and Lieutenant Todd felt it was enough to arrest King on suspicion of murder. King lived with a small child and a large dog, so the police felt uneasy about arresting him at his house. They decided to wait it out and apprehend him the next morning. They had no idea how violent he might be, but if he did commit this crime, they knew they were dealing with a dangerous man. Police called in the SWAT team for backup.
Hey, he's coming down.
There he is. As King went off to work, they forced his truck into a roadblock and made their move.
Your hands up! Put them up! Step out of the van. You're under arrest, right? Put your hands up.
After King was safely in custody, the police began to build their case. For that, they needed more evidence. They obtained a search warrant and inspected King's house, but they found nothing incriminating. They had divers search the river and the canal for remains. they came up dry. Without a body, a weapon, or any other evidence against him, Lieutenant Todd didn't have a case, and Danny King would go free. If King truly did try to destroy the evidence in a metal drum, they reasoned, the drum must be around somewhere. But all they had was a burned patch of grass. The police placed an ad in the paper to find the drum. Soon after the ad ran, police received a call from a local businessman. One of his employees noticed a suspicious-looking barrel behind their warehouse. Lieutenant Todd went out to inspect it.
You could see some debris inside the bottom. Reached in and picked up what I believed to be was a bone fragment. When I saw that, I just knew that this was the barrel that was used to burn the body of Marilyn Garland.
Todd shook the drum to remove more debris clinging to its interior. Out came nails, scraps of wire, some fabric, and a seed pod.
There's one seed in this vial here, and this was found in the barrel, okay? And we didn't know where it may have come from. Later, we had it identified as a catalpa seed. It's kind of an unusual tree, and there's not that many in the area. And there is a catalpa tree at 125 Canal Street, which is where the murder took place and where Danny burned Marilyn's body in the barrel.
But potentially, the most damning evidence pulled from the drum was also the smallest, tiny shards of bone. If Todd could prove they were the victims, he'd have a case. He sent them to the coroner for analysis. The coroner was fairly sure the bones were human.
However, he wanted them looked at by a top forensic anthropologist.
Okay, Rebecca,
He contacted Doug Owsley of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. Owsley has built an international reputation by identifying human remains. This wasn't the first time Owsley had worked with the Summit County Coroner's Office. A few years earlier, he helped them analyze the remains of Jeffrey Dahmer's first victim.
We've had cases where they involve dismemberment, where they will dismember parts of the body and they'll put them in different locations. We've had cases where they've used acids and corrosives and disfigurement of the body to try and make it difficult to say who that person is. They all tell you something about the individual behind that process, and in the same sense, they all leave different kinds of evidence.
In the case of Marilyn Garland, Owsley was literally scraping the bottom of the barrel. The evidence he had to work with consisted of 2.9 grams of bone fragments, about the weight of 3 paper clips. He also had 3 tiny shards of tooth enamel. All had been on fire for 2 days and were shrunken and distorted by the process. Could Owsley make sense of the paltry slivers?
So it looks like. Okay, and that's dark too, but
Forensic scientist Doug Owsley faced many challenges in his work on the Marilyn Garland murder. The first was confirming whether the bone fragments from the metal drum were human.
in this instance, we got really lucky because one of the fragments that was preserved was his finger bone. And if you think about it, different animals out there have very distinctive foot and hand bone structure. Think of a hoof, for instance, or what the foot of a dog looks like. It's very different than what we see in the human. And we've got not a complete bone, but actually just half of it, but it's enough of us, it's enough of the bone for us to actually be able to look at that and say, well, that's human morphology. Here, for instance,
Owsley's next task was more daunting. Could he tell if these were the remains of Marilyn Garland?
With burning, it takes maybe more time to analyze it, and you really have to know exactly what you're looking for. But you still, with the fragments of the bone, male skeletons tend to be bigger, females tend to, on average, to be smaller. And so how it is burned and the size that is the result of that process is still going to tell you often something about sex. Will still tell you something about age. And so it may make the identification much more difficult, more time-consuming, maybe more tedious, but there's going to be a lot of evidence there.
At the outset of the identification process, Owsley knew nothing about the victim's physical features. That's the way he prefers to work on a case.
The ideal circumstance often is not to know a great deal about it. It's better to be a little bit in the dark on that sort of thing, or a lot in the dark about that. Let the bones talk to you in terms of what they have to say what the evidence is from those.
From the remains, Owsley identified 2 rib fragments. The largest was a ½ inch long. He could tell one came from near the breastbone, perhaps the 4th or 5th rib. It provided the key to unlocking secrets about the body it came from. As we age, the rounded ends of our bones become more cup-shaped. The rib's cupped end suggested the person was between 24 and 40 years old. It was 3.4 millimeters thick by 13 millimeters wide. Owsley considered that small, even after assuming it shrunk up to 25% in the fire.
You can never, on a piece of bone that size, bet everything. But on the other hand, you can turn around and say, in terms of probability, in terms of comparative data that we have, it's likely that this is a very small person.
The size suggested the victim was either a female or a small male. To determine which, he compared the bone's height and thickness against a standard chart of rib measurements.
In females, the 5th rib is going to have an average width of 4.65 millimeters. Males, 5th rib is going to be 6.78, so it's much larger in terms of its thickness. So you work it through as best you can and try and characterize for the entire rib cage male and female values and what the difference is.
With this bone, the answer was clear. By all standards, the person it came from was petite, very likely a female. The bones had told him all they could. It was time to take a look at the tooth fragments. Owsley had only 3 to work with. They were little more than chips of enamel. By examining the thickness of the enamel, Owsley could tell they were from adult teeth. Their shape suggested their approximate position in the victim's mouth. They had telltale grooves that suggested dental work. But it wasn't enough. He needed some high-tech help to expose traces of fillings. Then he could match them to Garland's dental records. Owsley sent the teeth to the Smithsonian's Conservation Analytical Laboratory. There, they underwent a process called energy dispersive spectroscopy, or EDS. Most dental fillings are a combination of silver, tin, mercury, and copper. They melt in the heat of a fire, leaving behind invisible traces. The EDS brings them out. The tooth fragment is put into the chamber. Then the air is drawn out, creating a vacuum. An electron beam bombards the sample. It can be aimed very precisely. The EDS provides a 3D image, so the operator knows where to point the beam. The stream of energy excites electrons in the sample, causing some of them to fly off. Some elements give off more electrons, some produce fewer. By measuring the electrons spewing from the sample, the EDS determines what elements it's made from. The results come out as a graph of peaks and valleys. Each peak represents a different element. Its height corresponds to the amount of the element in the sample. The graph was printed out and given to Owsley to analyze.
This is an area here on this count, fragment 1, where we're scanning on the tooth surface. You can pick up the peak for calcium, peak for phosphorus, and those are normal tooth enamel. On that same fragment, if you go to a different location, here now we're starting to get a peak for tin, indicating the presence of tin on that tooth surface.
The EDS showed that 2 of the fragments had traces of copper, and all 3 had traces of tin. Because the metals were found only on specific parts of the teeth, Owsley concluded that they were the remains of fillings, not contamination from the metal drum. He had already determined from their shape that he had fragments of premolars. Now he knew they all had fillings. With this information, he was ready to compare his findings against Marilyn Garland's dental records.
So working with a dentist, I sat down, we went through and figured out which teeth she'd lost in life, which teeth had fillings, what types of fillings they were, and we would prepare a dental chart. And this is a basis for comparison with the dental fragments that we had.
Most of Marilyn Garland's premolars had fillings. So the fact that all of the fragments also had fillings was consistent with her dental records.
So I could never really say that it was absolutely this tooth or that tooth, but I could say that she in life had those teeth. And of those, 7 of those 8 teeth had fillings, and I've got 3 fragments of those teeth, and all of them have fillings. So it's a consistency there. It's a point that seems to support this association. So it's just one bit of evidence.
Those bits of evidence added up to create a portrait of a victim that was alarmingly similar to Marilyn Garland. Marilyn Garland, age 35, stood 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighed 115 pounds.
Obviously, they couldn't positively say that it was her, but he was able to say that it was a petite female, possibly white female, between the ages of 25 and 35. I mean, it really narrowed it down, which was, surprising to me, just to find some remains, charred remains, to be able to look at him and obtain that much information from him. That was surprising.
Awaiting trial, Danny King learned that he'd left enough evidence for scientists to come so close to identifying Marilyn Garland. Rattled by the news, he made one more mistake.
Danny King confessed a second time, this time to an inmate at Summit County Jail, and the inmate ended up telling us about it. And Danny King even told him where he had disposed of the gun.
King admitted stashing the gun in a storm sewer behind a restaurant. Detective Todd drove to the location and found it immediately. Police had all they needed: the confessions, the burned barrel, the weapon, and Doug Owsley, who turned a handful of splintered bones into rock-solid evidence.
I've been involved in a number of cases where you're searching for a missing person. You know that person in your heart, you know that person's dead. And they may even have good, strong evidence as to who's behind this. But without that body being recovered and without that physical evidence, you still could go to trial, but it gets much more difficult. It gets, you need a lot of good physical evidence, and a skeleton or a body is going to be a critical thing.
Danny King was found guilty of murder. He was sentenced to 21 years to life. Generations of murderers have relied on fire to hide their crimes. But some little detail always lingers for those who know what to look for. In Tennessee, investigators depended on scorched bones to divine not only a dead man's identity, but also the strange circumstances of his death. On January 15, 1981, a house burned to the ground in Kingsport, Tennessee, before the fire department could save it. The owner, James Grizzle, hadn't been seen since the blaze. Nobody gave it a second thought, because Grizzle spent much of his time in Virginia. Then, Detective James Moffett of the Kingsport Police received a call from Grizzle's mother in Virginia.
What's his name?
She was concerned because she hadn't heard from her son in several days.
Where does he live at?
Moffett smelled trouble. He knew that Grizzle had hired a live-in handyman named Stephen Leon Williams to help renovate the house. Williams was not a model citizen.
I knew Stephen Leon Williams, and I was investigating him on some burglaries. And I knew that Mr. Williams was living with Mr. Grizzle in Hawkins County. I talked to Mr. Grizzle probably about a week before his house burned about Leon.
The fire department didn't look for a body once the blaze was out. But after hearing from Grizzle's mother, Moffett began to suspect something more than a house fire. If Grizzle was in the house when it burned, his remains would still be there. Moffat would need an expert to determine if Grizzle's death was an accident or murder. He called state forensic anthropologist William Bass.
It's an interesting case because most houses that have burned down, the fire department's been there, lots of people have walked through the area. This was one of the few cases in which nobody had walked into this house at all. So you got there and the house had burned down, and there were no footprints in the house at all. So we were the first ones in there.
As you can see over here,
The undisturbed condition of the site assured Bass that any signs of foul play would still be there.
Mr. Grizzle may be in there.
Moffat pointed out the locations of the bedrooms, kitchen, and living room so Bass could get his bearings. As with any archaeological excavation, he and his team carefully sifted through the debris with trowels and brushes. They moved one brick at a time, searching for the all-important remains. A little over an hour after they began, Bass found some human lower leg bones on the concrete basement floor. Before long, scattered bones started coming out of the rubble, and with them, a horrible story began to emerge.
The body had been lying on its back, but the legs were up over the body, as if you lay down and take your feet and pull them up to your head. However, there was no head.
The victim was separated below the shoulders, and the upper and lower halves of the skeleton were 12 feet apart. That wasn't entirely unusual. A skeleton may become jumbled if the victim had fallen through the floor and landed in the basement. But Bass knew that wasn't the case here. Had the body fallen, he would have found debris between the skeleton and the concrete. Bass found no debris. In fact, the victim was fused to the floor.
It's like taking a piece of meat and putting it in a hot skillet. That meat will sear onto the hot surface. In this case, the fats running out were so hot that they literally solidified what clothing remained. So we had to scrape off the clothing, and there was no debris between the floor and the bones.
The condition of the clothing told Bass the victim was in the basement when the fire began. If the body didn't fall from a height, Bass knew of only one other way to explain how the bones became scattered: an explosion. Neighbors' reports confirmed Bass's conclusion. They heard a blast shortly before the fire. Judging from the way the upper torso was separated, Bass suspected the center of the explosion was on the victim's chest. It might have been some freak accident. But then Bass found another clue. The flattened remains of a spent bullet lay upon the basement floor, just below the victim's heart. Bass could tell from its mushroom shape that it had traveled through the victim and flattened against the concrete. At first glance, it looked like homicide. But homicide cases are won on hard facts, not speculation. To prove murder, he needed all the evidence he could muster. In his lab at the University of Tennessee, Bass has teased the truth from countless human remains. Here, he took a closer look at the bones pulled from Grizzle's house. He would try to determine what events caused the destruction of a home and the death of a person. With burned remains, it's not always easy. When a body burns, much of it is destroyed. The arms and legs separate. Fluid in the head turns to steam and bursts the skull. As bones burn, they retain their shape, but they shrink up to 33%, depending on the temperature of the fire, how long they were exposed to it, and which bones they are. Fire turns them brittle. They shatter while they burn and can crumble if they're touched or moved afterward. Collecting a complete skeleton is nearly impossible. Because burning disfigures bones, it's a common way to hide the cause of death. Investigators must learn to distinguish the subtle differences between damage caused by fire and damage from a murder weapon. Bass demonstrates that even a bullet in the head can go undetected unless the forensic investigator knows how to find it.
All of these pieces were all together in a jumble. We x-rayed this, and there is little flakes of lead in the bone, indicating, hey, this individual's been shot. Then we wanted, can we determine where this individual was shot? So we sat down and started putting the skull together, all of these pieces, and sure enough, here comes your entry wound right there.
Joanne Bennett, a student of Dr. Bass, is hoping to find a more efficient way to recognize injuries not caused by fire. In her research, she experiments with bone scraps from pigs. First, she damages them to simulate foul play, then burns them to see how they change.
We designed several different traumatic events to address the trauma that anthropologists recognize.
Bennett and other graduate students saw, strike, and stab a variety of pig bones. The bones are then photographed, x-rayed, and sketched to record every nuance of the damage. Once the bones have been cataloged, the students burn them. If they're lucky, they use a house scheduled to be torched for fire training. The goal is to simulate as closely as possible a real-world situation. After the smoke clears, the students pick through the rubble to retrieve as many bone fragments as they can find.
Oh, I found one.
They take the bones back to the lab and examine them to see if they can detect the marks they made. The marks made by a scalpel or saw blade survived the fire with no problem. The fine striations of the saw can even be seen with the naked eye. The marks made by the hammer are less easy to discern. Bennett is just starting her research. As she and her colleagues experiment with a wider sample of bones, she feels confident they'll come up with some guidelines forensic investigators can use in the future. With the remains in his lab, Bass pieced together the sorry events that transpired in James Grizzle's house. The flattened bullet and scattered bones suggested murder. The color of the bones backed that up. As bones heat up, their color changes. Forensic investigators depend on that to estimate the fire's temperature. Especially hot flames suggest an accelerant like gasoline was used. And that means arson. At about 545 degrees Fahrenheit, bones turn reddish or grayish brown. Between 970 and 1200 degrees, they turn black. Over 1200 degrees, all the organic material burns out, leaving a white shell of calcium. The remains in Grizzle's house were white. They must have burned at about 2000 degrees, indicating the use of an accelerant. Bass concluded the fire was deliberately set. Now, Bass was sure he could prove homicide. The burned remains told him that the victim was shot to death, the body blown apart, and the house set on fire to hide the crime. But who was the victim? Though reasonably certain it was James Grizzle, Bass had to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Without naming the victim, Moffat couldn't catch his murderer. To identify the victim, Bass first examined seams in the skull, called sutures. They slowly close as we grow older and are gone by age 40. Inside the skull of the victim, the sutures had disappeared. On the outside, they were almost completely gone as well.
Now this would indicate that he was not only 18, but was, middle-aged. You're getting at least 30s, so forth.
Age can be determined another way, by looking at the joint surfaces of the bones. As people age, the body deposits more bone around the joints, causing a condition called arthritic lipping. It begins in the late 20s or early 30s and increases with age. The lipping was consistent with someone in his mid-30s. James Grizzle was 38 years old. Bass next examined the external occipital protuberance, the bulge on the back of the head, to determine the victim's sex. The structure is larger in males than in females. It left Bass with little room for doubt that the victim was male.
This is one of the best ones I've ever seen. This is a classic textbook case of an external occipital protuberance which would indicate that this individual was a male. So by just this little piece you could get not only sex but age with that right there.
From the evidence, Bass determined the victim was a white male in his mid-30s, a description consistent with James Grizzle, but not close enough to hold up in court. To be absolutely positive, Bass relied on Grizzle's dental records.
You have this tooth with a filling that's attached to the tooth after the fire. So we asked the police if they could find from the family a dental record of him. We knew he'd been to the dentist because you could see there were fillings in here.
Bass compared the structure of the tooth and the shape of the root. From Grizzle's dental records, he was able to make his final determination. This was the skeleton of James Grizzle. The teeth provided Bass with a quick and easy way to make a difficult identification. But it was important that he first tried to make the ID using the bones. Otherwise, he'd have no way of knowing if more than one victim was buried in the rubble. If the bones and teeth all suggest the same person, Bass can be confident only one victim was buried there. That person was James Grizzle. Based on this information, Detective Moffat had a case against Leon Williams. It was further bolstered by the discovery that Williams had stolen James Grizzle's truck and forged his checks. Faced with the evidence, Leon Williams confessed. In his confession, he confirmed Bass's careful reconstruction of the crime. He shot James Grizzle in the basement, poured gasoline throughout the house, strapped an explosive to the victim, and when it went off, it set the house on fire. For his crime, Leon Williams was sentenced to life.
If you don't destroy the evidence, if you don't bring in a bulldozer and clean it all off or something like that, the evidence is there. If you know what to look for. It takes you a while, but we were able to reconstruct the events that occurred in this case exactly the way the individual who was charged and convicted said it happened.
William Bass unmasked a killer who went to great lengths to disguise his crime. Elsewhere, a man went to greater lengths to bring the bones of his missing brother back from Guatemala. Guatemala, 1985. A country caught in a civil war between the government and communist guerrillas. In the outlying villages, the government appoints civil patrollers, an armed militia made up of civilians. Everyone must serve 1 day a week. The government provides guns, but no training. It instructs the militia to patrol for communist rebels, but nobody patrols the militia. For hungry young journalists, 1985 was an exciting and dangerous time to be in Guatemala. Freelance American journalist Nick Blake and photographer Griffith Davis underestimated that danger. In their pursuit of a story, they headed into a remote part of the country and vanished. Nick Blake's brother Randy did all he could to uncover what happened.
My brother disappeared in March of '85. I'd been doing requests with the State Department and 4 or 5 other federal agencies who would be in a position to know things, such as the CIA and the National Security Agency and others for ever since, probably 1987.
Randy Blake found only dead ends. Then, a year and a half into his search, he heard an unconfirmed story from an American teacher in a village in Guatemala.
We would go to little fiestas with them and so forth, and you got to know them, and they would talk about the gringos that got killed by the Civil Patrol.
Piecing together the details, the teacher believed the Civil Patrol shot the journalists in 1985. A ravine became their makeshift grave. The Blake family kept pressure on the U.S. and Guatemalan governments to find Nick. To hide the crime, the Civil Patrol retrieved the skeletons and burned them in a raging bonfire. The flames split and shattered the bones beyond all recognition. Or at least that's what the patrollers thought. But the Blake family persisted. The patrollers were pressured into sending the remains to the United States. They arrived in 1990, but an analysis uncovered a deception. The crate did not contain human remains. Convinced they had exposed a cover-up, the Blakes and U.S. authorities demanded the truth. Felipe Alva, the regional commander of the Guatemalan Civil Patrol, refused to talk about the incident until the Blakes offered an incentive.
And he was going to be offered a $10,000 reward. And so, but it was going to be paid to him in allotments as he performed along the job.
Enticed by the offer, Alva agreed to send the real remains to the U.S. so long as the family promised not to prosecute.
He came out with a partial unearthing of remains from the site, and he brought them back in 2 boxes, very curious things. They were essentially little caskets, mini caskets, square pine boxes that were velvet lined. And it was the strangest thing because they had dirt in them from the site with little bone chips salted throughout them and so forth, because that's essentially what was remained in my brother and his friend.
The grim homecoming occurred without ceremony at a loading dock behind the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. The unmarked remains had traveled over 3,000 miles to get there. Navigating through a maze of deception and lies. But more work lay ahead before the Blakes could put their loved one to rest and find the closure they sought. This time they had to be certain the bones in the crates were truly Nick's and Griffith's. For the delicate task of identifying the remains, they pinned their hopes on forensic anthropologist Doug Owsley. When the crates arrived, they were x-rayed to see if they required special handling to avoid damage. They contained no surprises. Mostly soil, ash, roots, and bits of bone. Then Owsley and his team sorted the bones. It was immediately apparent the remains were human. They also found a duplication of parts and a color difference. Owsley was certain these were the remains of 2 people. Out of 150 pounds of dirt and debris, they recovered about 2 pounds of incinerated bone. The largest of the more than 1,600 fragments was just 3 inches long. But Owsley was fortunate. Some of the fragments came from the occipital protuberance at the back of the skull. The large size of the specimens indicated both were male. But they could have been almost any 2 men. Then he found a nickel-sized piece of bone that made all the difference. It was a fragment that fits in the forehead and forms a ridge or crest for the sinuses inside the skull. It's called the frontal crest.
Now this is a really unusual configuration of the frontal crest here. Usually this is a solid, prominent ridge, but in a small percentage of the population you can get a double ridge morphology like that. So we had this piece, and based on that, I had a microfilm of an X-ray that was taken of Griffith Davis.
Owsley compared the crest with an X-ray of Davis's head taken after a car accident. The unusual structure of the bone fragment from Guatemala matched the X-ray. But did that prove the fragment came from Davis's skull? Not unless Owsley could first prove that its structure was truly rare. To see how often the crest structure occurred in the general population, Owsley referred to a group of skeletons known as the Terry Collection. The more than 1,600 skeletons of the Terry Collection were donated for medical research from the 1920s to the 1940s. They represent a cross-section of the population. The medical history of each individual is part of the record. Owsley used the Terry Collection to see what percentage of the population shared Davis's frontal crest structure.
We'll take this one.
If only a few people had that bone configuration, and if it was shared by the Guatemala sample and Davis, then Owsley could reasonably conclude the bones could belong to Davis.
If you look at this cranial vault, for instance, one of the things that you've got is here's the cribriform plate, foramen cecum, and then you've got this standard type of frontal crest. And it's a very prominent ridge that occurs in 88% of white males. Now, in contrast, you see how you've got, again, the same structure, but now we've got a double ridge and a groove. This is the type that we see in Griffith Davis's cranium. This occurs 9% of the time.
Davis and the remains from Guatemala shared the same rare anatomical feature. Owsley felt confident the skull fragments could belong to Davis. But were the remaining bones Nick Blake's? The limited sample enabled Owsley to perform only one more test, determining the relative age of the bodies. For this, he relied on the sutures in the skulls. In the specimen that Owsley thought to be Griffith Davis, the sutures showed advanced closure, suggesting a man in his 30s. The sutures on the other remains were still open, indicating a younger man.
So that helped differentiate. The two males were differing in age by about 11 years. And this helped me determine that this is the older person.
At the time of his death, Griffith Davis was 38. Nick Blake was 27. Owsley's calculation was right on the mark. To Randy Blake, Owsley's identification was encouraging, but naggingly inconclusive. If these bones were truly the remains of his brother, he needed to be absolutely sure. As long as a shadow of doubt persisted, the Blakes could not give up their search. But Owsley had reached his limit. He could go no further without more remains.
We said to ourselves, it's probably Nick, but darn it, we want to get up to that site and we want to determine definitely that this is Nick, and let's just make a trip down there. We've got an opportunity.
Going to Guatemala was the only choice the Blakes had if they wanted to honor their brother. But Owsley had to accompany them. Only he could provide the assurance the Blakes had waited so long for. Together, they would retrace the final steps of Nicholas Blake and Griffith Davis. With forensic anthropologist Doug Owsley's help, Randy Blake felt he was close to finding his brother. He knew that the only way to claim Nick's remains was to retrieve them himself. Randy, his brother Sam, Owsley, and a colleague made the trip to Guatemala in June 1992. There, they met Regional Civil Patrol Commander Felipe Alva. He took them to the remote mountain location of the remains. But Owsley wasn't buying it.
I take my trowel and do a little scraping. I cut down to about 15 centimeters, and I come up and say, this is the wrong site. I say there's not enough ash, there's no bone fragments here, there's none of the red soil that I'm looking for. I just looked at all of this 2 containers a couple months before, and there's none of the roots that were found in any of that.
Then, sheepishly, Alva's assistant reached under a log and removed a green plastic bag that contained a handful of human bone fragments and some soil.
And in this 8 ounces of soil, it's got the right color, it's got the charcoal, it's got root fragments. And I say, this is from the right site. And he says, I got it right here.
The assistant told them these were the last of the remains. The Americans demanded to see where they came from.
We went back to our little hotel in Nabob, and we basically grilled Felipe Alva for 3 hours that night with a Guatemalan colonel, U.S. Embassy defense attaché, U.S. Army colonel, a couple of other people in the room, and basically said Alva, you lied to us.
Under duress, Felipe Alva agreed to take the team to a site he swore was the actual location of the remains. When they arrived 2 days later, Owsley looked it over with a skeptic's eye.
We could see the indentation where the soil had been taken out. We worked it around the perimeters, and we found a lot of things. One of the things we found lots of was metal. Well, here's part of an eyeglass frame, part of the eyeglass piece in the frame, and it's a circular type of pattern. And it's just one of the things that when we first picked it up, one of the brothers of this man said, that looks like his glasses. So we knew that we were in a very significant spot.
Now certain they had the right spot, the team collected all they could and headed home.
It was almost like tailor-made for Doug Owsley. I mean, it was so perfect because he we were so lucky to have him in that one day, because clearly a deception was planned and was being executed, clearly. And he just totally blew it out of the water by being there and allowed us to have the ammunition to get this guy to come clean.
Among the bones Doug Owsley carried back with him were fragments of a shattered jawbone. They still held some of the teeth and all the roots. They would enable him to make a direct comparison to Blake's dental records.
From the dental records that we had of him in life, we knew that he had impacted third molars. And they had come in at an angle where the third molar had bumped into the second and had gotten locked up. And so what it had actually done is wore a contact or a wear facet into the side of the second molar. And it had a very distinctive root associated with it.
From the shape of the teeth and roots, Owsley was able to positively identify Nick Blake. For the Blake family, it marked the end of a grueling, emotional ordeal. Now they could grieve Nick's loss and give his remains a proper burial.
That meant everything, to repatriate his remains and bring them back and bury them in a cemetery and give them a grave marker, which we did.
Not enough remains of Blake or Davis were recovered to confirm they were shot. For the Blakes and the Davises, that was no longer important. Bringing Nick and Griffith home was enough. From the ashes of murder rise lingering clues, transformed but never erased. As scientists learn to read their meaning, they can restore what the fire has taken. And by doing so, find a loved one or catch a killer.